Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 107, Robespierre to the Rescue. When we last left Paris in 1793, dechristianisation was triumphant. Churches were closed, priests were forced to marry, the cult of reason had even seized the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Yet, while some celebrated the ascendancy of philosophy, one Jacobin was deeply troubled. Perceiving these upheavals to be the work of a vast foreign plot, the time had come for Robespierre to intervene. But before the incorruptible strikes back against this new fanaticism, I want to take a moment to thank you for being a fanatical supporter of Grey History. Your contribution keeps this show on the air, and I can't stress enough how grateful I am for your support in creating history that isn't black and white. Now, it's with tremendous pleasure that I welcome the newest, greatest people on the planet. A warm welcome to our newest virtuous citizens, Norcal, Charles, William, Don Scarface, Granville, Anna, Joshua, Jeremy, Seth, Dave, Vivek, and Drew. Also, a huge thank you to our newest true revolutionaries, Kevin and Dr. Chuck in Pittsburgh. Of course, every revolution needs champions, so thank you so much to the newest champions of the people, David B. and Bobcat. Lastly, thank you to every member of the entire Grey History community, including the Pantheon of Heroes, Brian, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Gilberto, Kevin S., and Griff. Given the course of his early life, it's perhaps a surprise that Robespierre was a bad Catholic. Raised in part by aunts known for their sincere beliefs, the lawyer's education was due only to the church. A student at the prestigious Lycée Louis le Gras, it had been a church scholarship which had provided his tuition. Likewise, at the age of 23, it was the church which appointed him a magistrate, a promotion rather exceptional given his youth and inexperience. Educated, elevated, and empowered by the Catholic Church, it is interesting that this self-described bad Catholic had never considered a career in the First Estate. In this, he differed from peers like Lazare Carnot and even his own father, who had almost joined the priesthood. Yet, like Carnot and some others in the convention, Robespierre's coldness towards Catholicism was hardly absolute. A student of Rousseau, the incorruptible was no atheist, and he sincerely believed in something. Moreover, he believed in the necessity of something. To quote Robespierre directly, if God did not exist, he would have to be invented. Given this position, the developments of late 1793 were deeply troubling for Robespierre. With dechristianisation spreading across the country, it was his own colleagues which were closing churches, marrying priests, and propagating the atheistic cult of reason. Disgusted and alarmed at these needless provocations, it was thus with some irony that this bad Catholic became a defender of the faith. Robespierre's opposition to dechristianisation can be viewed through three critical perspectives. Pragmatically, ideologically, and politically, the atheism espoused by the ultras were a threat which had to be neutralised. For most historians, Robespierre's intervention is framed primarily on pragmatic terms. Through this outlook, there's no shortage of reasons in which to view the campaign as utterly foolish. Firstly, the Republic was engulfed in civil and foreign wars. With the West in flames and the siege of Toulon ongoing, the last thing the government needed was the armed insurrection of millions of sincere Catholics. Secondly, the French nation was dangerously isolated. At war with most of Europe, the French could count their friends on just a single hand. For now, the United States was supplying wheat, while the Swiss were remaining neutral. However, that might not last, especially if the French offended those republics known for their religious sensibilities. Lastly, the question had to be asked: just why would one risk greater unrest and further isolation? What precisely was the benefit? To be clear, Robespierre supported initiatives like stripping churches of their wealth to fund the national war effort. But forced marriages, closing churches, conversions of holy sites to temples of atheism, those were needless provocations with no tangible benefit for a nation already beset by crises. Yet, in addition to this pragmatic opposition, Robespierre was hostile from an ideological perspective. Put simply, the deputy distrusted atheism. Far from the endpoint of reason, he perceived atheism as a doctrine of the elites, one that was alien to the common people. More specifically, he viewed the new cult of reason as a danger, a dishonourable assault on the nation's social fabric. To underscore this point, it's crucial to note that Robespierre wasn't just horrified by the cult's provocative festivities. Instead, he also believed that the principles it espoused were toxic to a healthy and prosperous society. For Robespierre, the ideas of a god and the immortality of the soul were beneficial for a nation. Without belief in a supreme being to protect the oppressed or to punish the wicked, society might unravel into lawlessness and vice. Historian François-Alphonse Hollart argues that in this, Robespierre drew from Rousseau's concepts of civil religion. According to the philosopher Rousseau, a national faith and its sentiments of sociability were necessary for a society to flourish. Put differently, a god was required to promote justice, stability, and morality. Holding a similar perspective, Robespierre was more than willing to denounce atheism as aristocratic. With its activities outraging morals and destabilizing society, the dechristianisation campaign was an unacceptable threat to the Republic of Virtue. But, as a quick aside, I did enjoy historian Ruth Sker's observation that Robespierre's ideological opposition was potentially mixed with personal grievance. Sker notes that Robespierre hoped to introduce his own novel religious ceremonies, and as such, the ultras and their cult of reason had stolen his thunder for the future cult of the Supreme Being. Consequently, it is possible that amidst these sincerely held beliefs, a bruised ego was nursing additional hostility. Finally, it should be noted that Robespierre's stance was partially political. To speak plainly, Hébert and the Parisian radicals were a threat. For months, the Paris Commune had dictated terms to the national government, and most recently, leading municipal figures had compelled the convention to adopt ever more radical measures. Worryingly for Robespierre, Hébert was demanding the partial implementation of the Constitution, a measure designed to empower the ministers of the Executive Council and perhaps himself as a future minister. Moreover, such actions would retire the Committee of Public Safety, abolishing the current nerve centre of the government and Robespierre's role within it. But as Robespierre took stock of unfolding events, it became clear that the dechristianisation campaign was more than a vehicle for mere political advantage. It was a conspiracy. By now, Robespierre had become convinced that vast foreign plots were undermining the Republic. Remember, the Jacobin deputies Fabre de Glantine and François Chabot had identified sinister schemes which were led by prominent foreigners. Although Chabot's tale contradicted Fabre in parts, both men emphasized the existence of elaborate international machinations. While unsure of the details, Robespierre was now certain that something was afoot. With so many ultra-radicals tied to foreigners and atheism, it was easy to believe Fabre's assertion that some ultras were deliberately attempting to destabilize the Republic. After all, if one was trying to provoke internal unrest and diplomatic isolation, dechristianisation was the card to play. As such, for pragmatic, ideological, political, and perhaps personal reasons, Robespierre was aghast at developments in late 1793. Unable to sit back while the foreign plot tore the Republic apart, the time had come to intervene. For those desperate to halt the rise of new fanatics, relief came at the Jacobin Club on the 21st of November. Better known by its date on the revolutionary calendar, the 1st of Frimaire, it was now that Robespierre rebuffed the ultra-radicals. 11 days after the infamous Festival of Reason was celebrated in the former Cathedral of Notre Dame, it's possible that Jacques Hébert anticipated the attack. Eager to speak before Robespierre, he proclaimed to the Jacobins whispers of a new conspiracy which would see Robespierre denounce him and other members of the Paris Commune. Hedging his bets and hinting that these rumours were perhaps themselves part of a plot, he nonetheless used the opportunity to bolster his own image. Opening fire on his moderate nemesis, Hébert attacked Danton, who, after several weeks from the capital, had abruptly returned to Paris. Unbothered by Hébert's posturing against both himself and Danton, Robespierre took to the floor of the society. In the speech that followed, he offered a full-throated assault on atheism. The resulting speech is full of quotable quips, but as we explore it, I want you to note how Robespierre draws on both pragmatism and ideology to condemn this new extremism. Opening his speech by surveying the current state of affairs, Robespierre questioned the revolution's fixation on religious fanaticism. Proclaiming it to be dying, he noted that 5 years of revolution had struck down both the priesthood and its influence. Even in the Vendée, known for its religious fervour, Robespierre dismissed the dangers of zealots and fanatics. Instead, these fugitives were motivated by plunder, not religion, and had only been enabled through the initial treason of the Girondins. Of course, historians may beg to differ with this retelling of events, but what's important is Robespierre's insistence that the threat still posed by religion was due exclusively to the misguided belief that any threat remained. Now, having dismissed the danger posed by religious fundamentalism, and having reminded his audience of the atheist leanings of many Girondins, it was time for the incorruptible to make his case. A former member of the National Assembly, Robespierre had helped to craft 2 declarations of rights, both of which enshrined religious liberties. Unwilling to abandon this principle, and believing it unwise to do so, Robespierre warned that the true fanatics were not those who said Christian Mass, but those who wished to prevent it. It has been assumed that by accepting civic offerings, the convention had outlawed Catholic worship. No, the convention did not take this rash step, and it never will. Its intention is to maintain the freedom of worship that it proclaimed, and at the same time to repress all those who would abuse it to disturb public order. It will not allow the persecution of peaceful ministers of religion. and it will punish them severely whenever they dare to use their office to deceive citizens and to incite prejudice or royalism against the Republic. Priests have been denounced for saying Mass. They will say it longer if they are prevented from doing so. He who wants to prevent them is more fanatical than he who says Mass. Building on this point further, Robespierre warned of efforts to sow trouble and division. False patriots, unknown until recently, had emerged to attack fanaticism with even greater zealotry. Attempting to marshal popularity through ridiculous farces, Robespierre posed a simple question. Why should they be allowed to mock the dignity of the people and attach the bells of folly to philosophy? There are men who want to go further, who, under the pretext of destroying superstition, want to make a kind of religion of theology itself. Every philosopher, every individual, can adopt whatever opinion they please on this matter. Anyone who would make it a crime is a fool. But a public figure, a legislator, would be 100 times more foolish. Who would adopt such a system? The National Convention abhors it. The Convention is not a writer of books, an author of metaphysical systems. It is a political and popular body, charged with ensuring respect not only for the rights, but also for the character of the French people. It was not in vain that it proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the presence of the Supreme Being. It may perhaps be said that I am a narrow-minded man, a man of prejudices. What do I know? A fanatic. I've already said that I speak neither as an individual nor as a systematic philosopher, but as a representative of the people. Atheism is aristocratic. The idea of a great being who watches over oppressed innocents and punishes triumphant crime is entirely popular. The people, the unfortunate, applaud me. If I were to find any critics, they would be among the rich and the guilty. From my school days onward, I was a rather poor Catholic. I have never been either a cold friend or a faithless defender of humanity. I am all the more attached to the moral and political ideas I have just presented to you. If God did not exist, he would have to be invented. Unapologetic in his belief that a great being was entirely popular, Robespierre was not content with defending freedom of religion. For him, atheism was aristocratic, and he denounced those who might criticize his stance as among the rich and the guilty. Yet, that does beg the question, why were his critics guilty? In this speech, Robespierre had already stated the right of every individual to adopt whatever opinion they pleased. Consequently, atheism was not a crime, even if he thought it ill-advised. But what was a crime was treason, and it's here that we can reintroduce the foreign plot. Convinced that nefarious schemes were behind recent events, the leading Jacobin was determined to expose this existential threat. Listing the names of many prominent foreigners, Robespierre called for a cleansing of both the Jacobin society and the revolution as a whole. Critically, those attacked included men named by the self-serving Fabre d'Églantine. Remember, Fabre had informed Robespierre that foreign ultra-radicals were attempting to implode the Republic from within. Now, Robespierre was willing to openly accuse them of doing so through the pursuit of dechristianisation. warning that a vast plot was afoot to discredit the Republic, the Incorruptible demanded action against these foreign foes. Do you not see the trap set for us by the enemies of the Republic and the cowardly emissaries of foreign tyrants? By presenting the failings of a few individuals and their own extravagance as the general opinion, they would like to make us odious to all peoples in order to strengthen the tottering thrones of the scoundrels who oppress them. What time have they chosen for these machinations? The time when their combined armies have been defeated or repelled by the Republican spirit. The time when they want to stifle the rumblings of peoples wary or indignant at their tyranny. The time when they are pressuring the neutral nations and allies of France to declare themselves against us. The cowards only want to carry out all the gross calumnies, the impudence of which all of Europe recognized, and to drive away from you, through prejudice or religious opinions, those whom morality and the common good would draw to the sublime and holy cause we defend. I repeat, we have no other fanaticism to fear than that of immoral men, bribed by foreign courts to awaken fanaticism and to give our revolution the veneer of immorality, which is the characteristic of our cowardly and ferocious enemies. I have spoken of foreign courts. Yes, they are the true authors of our ills and our internal discord. Their aim is to debase, if possible, the French nation, to dishonour the representatives it has chosen, and to persuade the people that the founders of the Republic have nothing to distinguish them from the lackeys of tyranny. They have two kinds of armies. One, on our borders, powerless, closer to ruin, as the Republican government gains strength and as treason ceases to render useless the heroic efforts of the soldiers of the fatherland. The other, more dangerous, is in our midst, an army of spies, of paid scoundrels who infiltrate everywhere, even into the heart of popular societies. Since the leaders of a despicable faction, the firmest support of foreign thrones, perished, since the day of May 31 regenerated the National Convention which they wanted to annihilate, they have redoubled their activity to seduce, to slander, to divide all the defenders of the Republic, to debase and dissolve the National Convention. Naming foreign Jacobins he accused of treason and sedition, Robespierre convinced his peers to purge the political society. This was eagerly adopted, and the deputy was greeted with renewed applause as he reiterated his calls to respect freedom of religion. But Robespierre was just one deputy, and the Jacobin Club was neither the Paris Commune nor the National Convention. For liberties to be restored, what mattered was support from government, support which was hardly guaranteed. The reaction of elected officials to Robespierre's intervention was mixed. Locally and nationally, it was clear that Robespierre's position would be met with entrenched opposition. Starting with Paris, the ultra-radicals of Town Hall were both cautious and calculated. The Bertists knew Robespierre would be a powerful enemy, and so they attempted to mitigate any breach with temporary concessions. For example, as Robespierre lobbied to rein in dechristianisation, the Commune clarified some of its previous hostility. Historian François-Alphonse Allard describes officials as frightened as they withdrew an earlier edict preventing congregations from hiring private premises for private worship. More noticeably, the authorities also curtailed the provocative ceremonies of the cult of reason. Remember, the Cathedral of Notre Dame had been desecrated just 2 weeks before Robespierre's speech with scandalous festivities. However, the ultra-radical municipality had not lost its nerve. Instead, it was biding its time and would soon capitalise on the action and inaction of an inconsistent national convention. Up the road, the representatives were hardly convinced by Robespierre's rhetoric. Remember, fellow deputies had led regional anti-clerical campaigns, while others remained concerned that religious fanaticism remained a real and present danger. In such circumstances, it took the assistance of Danton to muscle through reforms. Taking his cause to the floor of the convention, Robespierre made his case on the 5th of December. 2 weeks after his initial speech at the Jacobins, the incorruptible pressed his colleagues to formally rebuke dechristianisation. Proposing an official reply to the Manifesto of Kings, he spoke not for himself, but for the Committee of Public Safety. In this position, he denied that the French people had ever prescribed religion. Instead, a foreign plot sought to divide and distract the Republic, while kings deprived millions of their own liberty. Speaking to the peoples of Europe directly, Robespierre defended the revolution, denounced royal conspiracies, and pushed his colleagues to do the same by protecting freedom of religion. Your masters tell you that the French nation, the French Revolution, has outlawed all religions. It has substituted the worship of a few men for that of the divine. They portray us to you as an idolatrous or insane people. They lie. The French people and their representatives respect freedom of all religions and outlaw none. They honour the virtue of humanity's martyrs without infatuation or idolatry. They abhor intolerance and persecution, whatever pretext they may use. They condemn the extravagances of philosophism, as well as the follies of persecution and the crimes of fanaticism. Your tyrants attribute to us certain irregularities, inseparable from the tumultuous movements of a great revolution. They attribute to us the effects of their own intrigues and machinations of their emissaries. All that the French Revolution has produced that is wise and sublime is the work of the French people. Everything that bears a different character belongs to our enemies. All reasonable and magnanimous men are on the side of the Republic. All treacherous and corrupt beings are on the side of your tyrants. Do we slander the star that animates nature because of light clouds that glide across its radiant disk? Does august liberty lose its divine charms because the vile emissaries of tyranny seek to profane it? Our misfortunes and yours are the crimes of the common enemies of humanity. Is this a reason for you to hate us? No, it is a reason to punish them. Rejecting the lies of foreign courts, Robespierre claimed that the French respected the freedom of all religions. To be frank, that's clearly a lie, but Robespierre wished to make it a reality. Agreeing that dechristianisation was losing the battle for hearts and minds, the convention formally published this reply to the Manifesto of Kings. Henceforth, the government's position was clear. Religious liberties were guaranteed. Yet, if dechristianisation was to truly end, the Republic needed policy to match proclamations. The next day, the convention followed the committee's recommendation and passed a new decree. Going forward, the body outlawed all violence and other measures contrary to the freedom of religion. That alone may imply an end to dechristianisation, but, as we'll see, the reality was very different. Even in this initial decree, articles specified that existing laws against refractory priests remained in full effect. Furthermore, attempts to harness religion for counter-revolution was of course prohibited, and local authorities were still allowed to enact police and public safety measures. Critically, these safeguards to prevent unpatriotic acts were further enhanced in subsequent days. Although I found it unclear who was lobbying for alterations, the decree was adjusted to explicitly protect prior actions of the representatives on mission. Now, I'll say that again. The decree was deliberately altered to permit prior actions. Consequently, in upholding the previous initiatives of representatives on mission, and in empowering local authorities to protect public order, the fact is that regional dechristianisation had been given a free hand. Sure, provocative ceremonies were no longer advised, but closing churches, destroying religious symbols, and arresting suspected priests could all be portrayed not as an infringement of liberties, but as measures of public safety. This is precisely what occurred. It's for this reason that over the next year, the vast majority of churches remained closed. It's for this reason that Christmas was essentially cancelled in 1793, despite religious liberties being proclaimed just 3 weeks prior. In essence, while the national government spoke favourably of freedom of worship, anti-clerical forces could use loopholes and other legislation to pursue their own independent objectives. At times, this brought them into conflict with Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. But what precisely could be done? If a representative on mission closed churches and claimed that local priests were promoting counter-revolution, was Paris really going to override them? No, absolutely not. As such, after December 1793, religious liberties remained largely theoretical. As historian Michel Vauvel notes, the different policies of representatives on mission, counter to the line defined by the Committee of Public Safety and the Convention, contributed to perpetuating a hard line of dechristianizing activism which extended over a long period, up to Thermidor and beyond. Now, given this perpetuation of dechristianizing activism, it is worth asking the question: how should we evaluate Robespierre's intervention? Clearly, Catholicism was not restored to its preeminent place. But that was never his objective. Remember, Robespierre was a deist, one whose motivation to halt dechristianization was not to protect the status of Christianity. Instead, he desired to preserve public order and morality, while also preventing diplomatic isolation and the implosion of the Republic. In this, it can be argued he achieved partial success. From December, the provocative cult of reason became increasingly curtailed, while Switzerland and the United States remained neutral. Likewise, the Hébertist momentum was temporarily halted, and foreigners suspected of treason were purged from the Jacobin club. As such, certain historians regard this intervention as successful. Historian Albert Métis, for example, seems to find nothing but praise. Describing the effect of his intervention as enormous, Métis credits Robespierre with empowering the convention to finally confront the demagogues. Moreover, he portrays the Hébertists as humiliated and discredited, all thanks to Robespierre's actions. However, historian Georges Lefebvre, another Marxist historian, reaches a different conclusion. For him, any victory was relative. Far from humiliation, Lefebvre even states that the Hébertists could be considered triumphant due to the ongoing pursuit of a more subtle dechristianization by local authorities. Actually, the committee's success was entirely relative. On 18 Frimaire, Year 2, December 8, 1793, the convention stipulated that the decrees of deputies on mission who had closed the churches would remain in effect. The Commune allowed the constitutional clergy to practice their worship in private, but the churches of Paris remained closed. Some deputies on mission conformed to the committee's intentions, but most of them felt that security measures should not be confused with violence. Since they considered the influence of the constitutional priests detrimental, they bullied or imprisoned those who refused to resign. On March 26, 1794, the convention itself suspended the payment of ecclesiastical pensions, and more than one district stopped paying clerical salaries. Nevertheless, dechristianisation followed the uneven course already noted, for it depended greatly upon the local authorities. Some churches were closed hastily, but this did not prevent the arrest of those who had not previously attended masses celebrated by constitutional priests. Elsewhere, worship was suspended only tardily and with regret. In several regions, the resulting unrest gave reason for prudence. In Thermidor, some churches still remained open, but these became increasingly rare. In the last analysis, the Albertist spirit triumphed. The Montagnard dictatorship gained nothing from this obstinacy, for dechristianisation could only sow dissension among the lower classes. So, historians disagree on the extent to which Robespierre's intervention can be considered a success. Clearly, his rebuke of atheism had a significant impact, but anti-clerical policies remained thanks to half measures from the convention. Yet, when evaluating the success of Robespierre's response, we must not confine ourselves to the legislation concerning religious liberties. Simultaneously, Robespierre had secured a related victory of monumental importance. This was the decree of 14 Frimaire. Described by some scholars as the Constitution of the Terror, it's critical that we set the scene to introduce this significant reform. For several months, leading Jacobins had been trying to empower the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and other serving members had all been attempting to create what they viewed as a strong revolutionary government. Likewise, Danton, although no longer on the committee, had forcefully argued for further centralisation. For swearing a position on the body, he used this renunciation to underscore the need to bolster those he refused to join. However, as we've seen previously, the convention was not yet on board. In episode 100, Revolutionary Until the Peace, Varenne had proposed reforms that would clarify the powers of subnational authorities as well as the representatives on mission. The convention balked at the latter, and it was only after Saint-Just's forceful speech for revolutionary government that the convention subordinated some authorities to the Committee of Public Safety. Critically, the representatives on mission remained accountable only to the convention itself. Yet, these reforms were passed on the 10th of October, and anti-clerical representatives like Fouché were planting the initial seeds of dechristianisation as early as late September. Free from the committee's oversight, dechristianising deputies could pursue regional agendas with national consequences. Unsurprisingly, this anti-clerical freelancing from men behaving like provincial Caesars horrified those Jacobins who had long argued for greater centralisation. Moreover, the aggressive initiatives of local authorities only reinforced the view that reform was required. In fact, it must be noted that as it relates to dechristianisation, the actions of the revolutionary armies were particularly important. Not to be confused with the actual army of the Republic, the revolutionary armies were those roaming bands of sans-culottes created to appease the Hébertists. Well, far from securing bread for Paris, the revolutionary armies had provided much of the muscle and disorder that accompanied dechristianisation. Taken all together, men like Robespierre and Danton had only become more convinced that the nation required a strong and more centralised government. But before we see this so-called Constitution of the Terror, it must be noted that dechristianisation was not the only factor promoting the concentration of power. By now, the mass conscription of August was rapidly expanding the military bureaucracy. Likewise, economic controls from September were enlarging the civil administration. Importantly, many Jacobins were already convinced that counter-revolutionaries had infiltrated the government. Now, an even bigger government was an even bigger danger. As such, historian David Andres notes that the enlarged bureaucracy spawned further alarms about the power of public officials, requiring greater surveillance, regular purges, and restructuring for both efficiency and transparency. The ballooning administration thus required reform. All of this made the case for empowering the Committee of Public Safety, in addition to rogue representatives on mission and roaming revolutionary armies. So, by the start of December 1793, leading Montagnards renewed their push. With Danton having returned to the capital, the moderates bolstered the committee's agenda to successfully pass the Law of 14 Frimaire. Now, although this decree was not accompanied by cheering crowds or a menacing mob, the gravity of this legislation is significant. Achieving their long-held aim, the committee formally entrenched significant power at the expense of local authorities, elected officials, and the representatives on mission. Officially declaring the National Convention the sole centre of the impulse of government, all subnational authorities had their powers significantly curtailed. Henceforth, municipal, district, and departmental bodies had their responsibilities completely overhauled. For example, the departments were greatly reduced in importance, in part because they were generally seen as holding Federalist and Girondin sympathies. As such, their general councils, presidents, and attorneys general were all abolished. Moreover, everything relating to revolutionary laws and public safety were no longer in their jurisdiction. Now responsible for the distribution of taxes and the maintenance of roads, the law formally eliminated the old hierarchy which subordinated districts and communes to their local department. However, districts and communes were hardly left untouched, especially with restrictions to making proclamations. Going forward, it was expressly forbidden for any authority or public official to make proclamations independently. Furthermore, it was also forbidden to make decrees that were extensive, restrictive, or contrary to the literal meaning of the law, even under the pretext of interpreting or supplementing it. Reserving for itself the sole right to interpret decrees, the convention was essentially outlawing any independent action by lesser authorities. But the autonomy of subnational governments was then curtailed again. Empowering national agents, these men replaced many existing officers which had previously been elected by local communities. Now, Paris would have de facto control over their appointment, sidelining elected officials for their own trusted agents. Interestingly, this measure did provoke some debate in the convention, yet wartime necessities were prioritized over democratic principles. So, as it relates to municipalities, districts, and departments, the once powerful bodies had been neutered. Unable to interpret decrees or to proclaim their own, these bodies were restrained to merely implementing the laws of Paris. Additionally, some elected officials were steadily replaced by national agents, removing the autonomy and disorganisation of recent years. For historian Robert Palmer, these reforms swept away all intermediate agencies that could obstruct or twist the policies of the national government. Likewise, historian Albert Merty shares similar sentiments, remarking that the whole administration of France was now centred on Paris. Yet, while it was the convention that was empowering itself, realistically, it was the Committee of Public Safety which was the primary beneficiary. Increasingly positioned as the convention's preeminent committee, the decree of 14 Frimaire cemented its place. Henceforth, the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security possessed near universal authority over all bodies and officials. While the latter was focused on matters relating to policing and suspects, the Committee of Public Safety had a much broader remit, ranging from general governance to military, economic, and diplomatic affairs. The committee could intervene in pretty much anything. Even on matters of policing, it wasn't afraid to butt heads with the Committee of General Security. Moreover, on the topic of clashes between deputies, the Committee of Public Safety was further empowered by one major concession. As dechristianisation disturbed the peace, the convention formally subordinated the representatives on mission to the Committee of Public Safety. Those on mission were now required to correspond with the committee every week, that is to say, every 10 days, thanks to the new calendar. Only able to suspend and replace generals provisionally, they were also forbidden from opposing the convention's decrees and their orders from the superior committee, significantly reducing their independence. No armed forces, no taxes, and no forced or voluntary loans were able to be levied without the committee's approval. Stripped of their near limitless power, these mini Caesars lost much of their cherished autonomy. Finally, I must note that this legislation possessed further setbacks for the Hébertists. Already aghast at the new restrictions on their beloved Paris Commune, most revolutionary armies were formally abolished. 3 months prior, their creation had been a major victory for the ultras during the days of 4 and 5 September. Far from terror, it now appeared that order was the order of the day. Along with Robespierre's rebuke of the cult of reason, the radicals were battered and bruised. In summary, the law of 14 Frimaire is considered by some scholars to be the constitution of the terror. Not everyone agrees with this characterization, but they do acknowledge the enormous ramifications. In consolidating power in the convention, and more specifically its Committee of Public Safety, a centralized revolutionary government was finally established. Reversing years of administrative decentralization, it was now the convention, and the convention alone, which could issue and interpret decrees. Subordinating all local authorities and even representatives on mission, the competing agendas of so many institutions and officials were definitively curtailed. Given this, the consequences of this decree were numerous. Most importantly, many scholars see this legislation as creating a revolutionary dictatorship. For historian Georges Lefebvre, the executive power was now the essential organ of the regime. Nothing could contravene its actions or impair its prestige. With time, even the sessions of the convention became dull affairs as more and more power accumulated to the committees. As an extension to this, another key consequence was the end of the anarchic phase of the terror. To paraphrase Albert Merty, the chaotic and intermittent centralization of the past had finally been replaced with an ordered and permanent structure. placed above all rival institutions, the Convention and its committees were finally capable of asserting unquestioned preeminence. Of course, this would not go unchallenged, and some scholars would later denounce what they see as the start of a draconian dictatorship. But, for others, these reforms were a vital necessity. Only with a dictatorial government could the Republic hope to survive. To finish, I think it's best we turn to historian Robert Palmer, an expert on the Committee of Public Safety. Outlining the sweeping nature of these laws, Palmer also underscores their historic significance well beyond the Revolutionary era. The Law of 14 Frimaire, December 4, passed virtually as B.U. Varenne proposed it, definitely founded the revolutionary dictatorship. It was the constitution of the Reign of Terror. Nor was it merely ephemeral. It created the law bulletins, which existed until 1929, the organ by which French legislation was formally published. Setting up a strong central power, providing channels for the quick flow of authority from Paris to the remotest village, sweeping away all intermediate agencies that could obstruct or twist the policies of government, it recalled the age-old efforts of kings and ministers to bring order out of feudalism, and anticipated the means by which Napoleon organised modern France. The Law of 14 Frimaire, extraordinary through the circumstances in which it was enacted, proves the profound continuity that joined the Revolution to past and future. By the new law, the Convention became the sole centre of the impulse of government. Counterfeiting the law bulletins was to be punished by death. Officials who perverted the laws which they were charged with enforcing were to spend 5 years in irons and have half their property confiscated. All the constitutional authorities, departments, districts and communes to which the revolutionists of 1789 had given an almost unbounded freedom were put under the grim inspection of the two governing committees. A swarm of locally elected administrators, or those of them who survived the purge for which the new law provided, became national agents, removable at the pleasure of the Convention. Administrators were forbidden to assemble under any pretext. They were to correspond only in writing. Revolutionary armies not authorized by the Convention were dissolved. Committees of surveillance were integrated with the recognized agencies of government. No armed force, tax or loan was to be raised except by national law. No official or official body was to alter or expand its lawfully established functions. The enforcement of all these provisions was handed over to the Committee of Public Safety. The revolutionary government, thus consolidated, was still considered to be provisional. The constitution of the preceding summer, enshrined and venerated in the hall of the Convention, was still looked to as the ultimate basis of government. But the ideas that went into the Law of 14 Frimaire were not really provisional. They have contributed as much to the making of modern states as the more liberal philosophy for which the Revolution is better known. Modern states exist by the ideas of unity, order, subordination and efficiency, and by the idea of law as the will of a sovereign power. 20th century states, democratic or dictatorial, share these ideas, and these are the ideas of 14 Frimaire, proclaimed at a time when the rest of Europe was largely feudal. The Law of 14 Frimaire, it is hardly too much to say, had as permanent a significance as the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They were poles apart, for they attacked antithetical extremes, anarchy and despotism. Each was a statement of a fundamental demand, one for public order, the other for individual liberty. The dualism that they express is an old one in political science, and the practical commentary is also an old one. That the best state must have elements of both. More order than the men of 1789 arranged for. More freedom than the men of 1793 would allow. With the National Convention passing the law of 14 Frimaire, December 1793 had commenced with victories for Robespierre. From religious liberties to revolutionary reforms, the incorruptible had secured considerable and historic success. Yet, for all these accomplishments, trouble was on the horizon. Seeing these measures as the beginning of something greater, Danton would now return to politics to argue for the end of the terror. With the ultra-radicals stunned and the war beginning to turn, the time had come for moderates to re-emerge. Thank you for listening to episode 107, Robespierre to the Rescue. In the next episode, we'll witness the return of Danton to the political arena and set the stage for the bloody struggles of 1794. As always, thank you so much for your incredible support. Great History avoids the guillotine due to your generosity, and I simply can't thank you enough. If you ever have any questions or thoughts about the show, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day. Great History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Kevin S., and Griff. Joining the amazing heroes are the fantastic champions of the people: Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David S., Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Danny, Sophia, Kevin, Scott, Jersey, Alvaro, Eric, the whole country of Luxembourg, Randy, Barbara, Roby, David B., and Bobcat.